The crimson vows. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the secluded beach where Daniel knelt in the sand. His trembling hands clutched a small velvet box, its contents glinting in the fading light. Mia stood before him, her laughter soft and melodic, unaware of the storm of emotions churning within him. Beyond her, the waves crashed against the shore, their rhythmic roar almost drowning out the erratic thud of his heart. He had planned this moment for weeks, but now, as he opened his mouth to speak, a chill swept through him, an inexplicable dread that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. "Mia," he began, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at his insides. "You've been my light, my everything, since the moment we met. I can't imagine a life without you." The words flowed effortlessly, rehearsed yet sincere. He opened the box to reveal a ring, its diamond catching the last rays of sunlight. Mia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. But as she reached for him, Daniel's gaze shifted past her, toward the dark silhouette of the forest that loomed behind the beach. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, tall and shadowy, watching them from the trees. The moment passed, and Mia pulled him to his feet, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. "Yes," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "1,000 times yes." Daniel forced a smile, his eyes darting back to the forest. Figure was gone, but the unease lingered, a heaviness settling in his chest. That night, they celebrated at Mia's family cabin, a quaint yet eerie structure nestled deep in the woods. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood and burning logs from the fireplace. Mia's grandmother, a frail woman with piercing eyes, sat in a rocking chair, knitting quietly. Her presence was unnerving, her gaze lingering on Daniel as if she could see the unease he tried so hard to hide. As the evening wore on, Mia excused herself to fetch something from the attic, a box of her childhood keepsakes, she said. Minutes turned into an eternity as Daniel waited, the silence of the cabin pressing in on him. The fire crackled, its flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Mia returned, clutching a dusty leather-bound journal, its cover adorned with faded gold lettering, the eternal vow. They sat together on the couch, the journal resting on Mia's lap. Daniel felt a strange reluctance as she opened it, the pages brittle with age. The first entry was written in elegant, looping handwriting, the ink faded to a rusty brown. "To those who seek eternal unity in death," Mia read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "The crimson vow offers a bond unbroken, a love everlasting. But beware, for the price is steep, and the path is drenched in blood." She paused, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "What do you think it means?" He didn't know how to answer. The words sent a shiver down his spine, the weight of them settling in the air like a heavy fog. "It's probably just some old poetry," he said, forcing a laugh. But as Mia flipped through the pages, they found detailed instructions, a ritual, complete with symbols, incantations, and warnings. The more they read, the more the atmosphere in the room shifted, the warmth of the fire replaced by a creeping cold. Mia's grandmother stopped rocking abruptly, her eyes locking onto the journal. "Where did you find that?" she demanded, her voice sharp and trembling. Startled, Mia explained, but the old woman only shook her head, her expression one of fear. "Put it back," she insisted. "Some things are better left buried." But it was too late. The journal had already ensnared their curiosity, its dark allure impossible to resist. That night, as they lay in bed, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, their shapes unnaturally elongated. Mia slept soundly beside him, her breathing steady, but he was wide awake, his mind racing. The journal sat on the nightstand, its presence almost palpable in the darkness. He reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the cool leather, and for a moment he thought he heard a whisper of voice, faint and distant, urging him to open it. By dawn, the unease had not subsided. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Mia's grandmother was gone, her chair empty, the fire long extinguished. Daniel and Mia left soon after, the journal tucked into Mia's bag. As they drove away, Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood running cold. Standing at the edge of the forest was a figure, its form indistinct but undeniably human. It watched them leave, its presence a silent promise that their lives were about to change forever. Back in the city, the journal became a secret obsession for both of them. They pored over its pages in the dead of night, their conversations hushed and urgent. The ritual's instructions were cryptic, but one thing was clear. It promised a love that transcended death. The price, however, was steep, a blood sacrifice, each partner required to end the other's life. At first, they laughed it off, dismissing it as the ramblings of a madman. But the more they read, the more the idea took hold, its dark allure impossible to ignore. One evening, as they sat by candlelight, Mia looked at Daniel, her expression unreadable. "What if we did it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we tried the ritual?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Daniel hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of fear and temptation. Before he could answer, the candles flickered wildly, the flames turning an unnatural shade of crimson. In that moment, they both felt it, a presence, ancient and malevolent, watching them, waiting. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The journal's pages seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, the symbols and incantations calling to them with an irresistible pull. Mia reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of a blood-red crescent moon drawn on one of the pages. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, a strange mix of fascination and dread gripping him. "Do you really believe in this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Mia turned to him, her eyes dark and intense, and for the first time, he saw something in her that he couldn't quite place, a hunger, a desperation that mirrored his own. "I don't know," she whispered, "but what if it's real? What if this is our chance to be together forever?" The idea was intoxicating, and yet it filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows deepening, and the presence they had felt earlier seemed to grow stronger, more tangible. The journal had awoken something, and now it was watching, waiting for them to take the next step. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Mia, her face illuminated by the flickering crimson light of the candles. He wanted to tell her no, to throw the journal away and forget they had ever found it. But he couldn't. The promise of eternal love was too tempting, too powerful to resist. And so, in the silence of that room, shrouded in shadow and lit by unnatural fire, they made a silent pact, a pact that would bind them together in ways they could never have imagined. The journal consumed them. Nights turned into days as they pored over its pages, deciphering the cryptic symbols and archaic language. The ritual demanded preparation, specific herbs, ritualistic objects, and a location steeped in history and death. They found an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town, its crumbling walls and shattered stained glass windows perfect for their purpose. The air inside was heavy with decay, the faint scent of rot clinging to the stone. Mia lit candles, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls, while Daniel arranged the objects as instructed. The crescent moon symbol occupied the center of the altar, its edges stained with what looked like old blood. Neither of them spoke much as they worked, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. The journal warned against hesitation, claiming that doubt would invite disaster. Yet, doubt crept into Daniel's mind, a nagging voice questioning the morality of their actions. He glanced at Mia, her face pale but determined, and wondered if she felt the same. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if she were driven by a force beyond her control. The candles flickered, their light dimming momentarily, and Daniel swore he heard a whisper, low and guttural, echoing through the chapel. The ritual required a sacrifice, not just a physical act, but a surrender of the soul. They stood before the altar, their hands clasped tightly, the journal open between them. Mia recited the incantation, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The words were foreign, their syllables sharp and guttural, and the air grew colder with each phrase. Daniel joined in, his voice blending with hers, the words taking on a life of their own. The shadows around them deepened, the walls seeming to close in, and the candle's flames turned a sickly green. The crescent moon glowed faintly, its light pulsating in rhythm with their chanting. A sudden gust of wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Daniel instinctively reached for Mia, his fingers brushing against her arm, but she was already pulling away. The glow from the crescent moon intensified, casting an eerie red light over the altar. The journal's pages fluttered wildly, though there was no wind, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Daniel's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to focus. The ritual was working, and there was no turning back now. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The crescent moon's glow expanded, enveloping them in a crimson haze. Daniel felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were clawing its way into his heart, and he stumbled back, clutching at his shirt. Mia stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror and fascination, her lips moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. The voice grew louder, its words a command, and the pain in Daniel's chest intensified. They both screamed as the vision overtook them, a flood of images, visceral and horrifying. Blood spilled from the edges of the altar, pooling at their feet. The shadows twisted into humanoid shapes, their faces contorted in agony. The voice spoke again, this time in words they could understand. "The bond requires blood," it hissed. "One must fall for the other to rise." The images faded, leaving them gasping for air, their bodies trembling. The crescent moon's glow dimmed, the chapel returning to its former state, but the weight of the ritual lingered. Mia was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see it?" she asked, her eyes wide and unfocused. Daniel nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The journal's warnings had been real, and the ritual had revealed its true cost. They had to kill each other to achieve immortality, a price neither had fully comprehended until now. The realization hung in the air, suffocating and inescapable. Mia looked at Daniel, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes, not fear of the ritual, but fear of him. They left the chapel in silence, the weight of the ritual pressing down on them like a physical force. The journal, now heavy with the knowledge they had gained, felt like a curse in Daniel's hands. He wanted to destroy it, to burn it and forget they had ever found it, but he couldn't. The ritual had awoken something within them, something dark and insidious that wouldn't let them go. They returned to their apartment, the atmosphere cold and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to follow them, lurking in every corner. Sleep was impossible. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with the images from the ritual. Beside him, Mia was restless, her breathing shallow and uneven. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, and Daniel felt the urge to open the journal, to read the incantation again. He fought it, his hands clutching the sheets, but the pull was too strong. He sat up, his movements slow and deliberate, and reached for the nightstand. The journal's cover was icy to the touch, its presence almost alive, and as he opened it, the whispers grew louder. Mia stirred, her eyes opening to slits as she watched him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Daniel didn't answer, his fingers tracing the symbols on the page, the words of the incantation burning into his mind. The crescent moon glowed faintly, its light casting an eerie red hue over the room. Mia sat up, her breathing quickening, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the unspoken knowledge of what they had to do hanging between them like a guillotine. The ritual had bound them together, but it had also set them against each other. The night stretched on, the apartment growing colder with each passing hour. The whispers became a constant presence, their words a mix of encouragement and threats. Daniel and Mia sat in silence, the journal open between them, its pages almost vibrating with dark energy. They didn't speak of the ritual, but it was all they could think about. The bond required blood, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before one of them acted. The love that had brought them together was now the very thing that could tear them apart, and the weight of that realization was unbearable. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The shadows remained, the whispers lingered, and the crescent moon's glow had not faded. They went through the motions of their day, but the ritual was always in the back of their minds, its dark promise haunting their every thought. The journal lay on the table, its presence a constant reminder of the choice they had to make. The bond required blood, and as the days passed, the pressure grew, the line between love and madness blurring with each passing moment. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The first accident happened a week after the ritual. Daniel was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his hand. He looked down to see blood pooling around the knife, the blade buried deep in his palm. He hadn't slipped, the knife had seemed to move on its own, as if guided by an unseen force. Mia rushed to his side, her face pale as she pressed a towel to the wound. The blood soaked through the fabric quickly, its crimson hue darker than it should have been, and Daniel felt a strange warmth spreading through his hand. Mia insisted they go to the hospital, but Daniel refused. The wound healed unnaturally fast, the skin stitching itself back together within hours, leaving only a faint scar in its wake. They both knew it wasn't normal, but neither mentioned the ritual, as if speaking of it would make it real. That night, as they lay in bed, Daniel noticed Mia staring at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Do you think it's because of the journal?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, the weight of her question pressing down on him. The next accident was more severe. Mia was driving them to the grocery store when the car suddenly swerved, the wheel jerking violently in her hands. They crashed into a tree, the impact sending shards of glass flying through the air. Daniel woke up in the hospital, his head throbbing, to find Mia sitting beside him. She was unharmed, her eyes wide with fear, and she leaned in close to whisper, "It wasn't an accident. Someone forced us off the road." Daniel's blood ran cold, his mind flashing back to the ritual and the whispers that had haunted them since. When they returned home, the atmosphere in the apartment was tense. The journal sat on the kitchen table, its presence almost mocking, and neither of them dared to touch it. That night, Mia woke up screaming, her hands clutching her throat. Daniel turned on the light to see deep, angry red marks around her neck, as if someone had tried to strangle her in her sleep. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wild with terror, and she whispered, "It's the ritual. It's trying to force our hand." Daniel held her close, his heart pounding, but he couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something or someone was watching them. The accidents became more frequent, each one more violent than the last. A bookshelf toppled over, narrowly missing Daniel's head. A pot of boiling water slipped from Mia's hands, scalding her arm. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, every corner hiding a new threat. The journal seemed to taunt them, its pages flipping open on their own, the crescent moon symbol glowing faintly in the darkness. They tried to ignore it, to go on with their lives, but the ritual's influence was inescapable, its dark energy seeping into every aspect of their existence. One night, as they sat in silence, Mia broke down. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," she said, her voice trembling. "The journal wants us to act. It's not going to stop until we do." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, her words echoing his own thoughts. "We can't give in," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. The idea of killing her or being killed by her was unthinkable, but the ritual's pull was growing stronger, its whispers more insistent. The breaking point came when Mia collapsed in the bathroom, blood pooling beneath her from a cut that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Daniel rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he pressed a towel to the wound. "We have to finish it," she gasped, her voice weak but determined. "If we don't, it's going to kill us both." Daniel's heart ached, the weight of her words crushing him, but he knew she was right. The ritual demanded blood, and there was no escaping it. That night, as Mia slept, Daniel stood over her, a knife clutched in his hand. His mind raced, his heart pounding, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He loved her too much to end her life, even if it meant saving their bond. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor, and he sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He didn't notice the figure in the shadows, watching him with a cold, unblinking gaze, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. The next morning, Mia found the knife on the floor, its blade reflecting the pale morning light. She picked it up, her expression unreadable, and turned to Daniel, who was still asleep. For a moment, she stood there, the knife in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. But she couldn't do it, not yet. She set the knife down and left the room, the weight of their shared burden heavier than ever. The accident stopped after that, as if the ritual had decided to give them a reprieve. But the relief was short-lived. A few days later, Mia woke up to find Daniel standing over her, his eyes glassy and unfocused, a knife in his hand. She screamed, scrambling out of bed, and he seemed to snap out of it, dropping the knife with a look of horror. "I don't remember picking it up," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mia didn't respond, her mind racing with the realization that the ritual was no longer content to wait, it was forcing their hand. That night, they sat together, the journal open between them, the crescent moon symbol glowing faintly. "We have to do it," Mia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If we don't, it's going to kill us both." Daniel nodded, though his heart was breaking. The ritual had claimed them, and there was no escaping its dark promise. The first blood had been spilled, but it was only the beginning. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. The journal's presence was a constant reminder of the decision they had to make. Mia and Daniel avoided the topic, but it lingered in the air, unspoken yet oppressive. The apartment felt colder, the shadows darker, and the whispers more persistent. They tried to distract themselves, to find solace in each other's company, but the ritual's pull was inescapable. It was as if the journal had embedded itself in their minds, its words whispering promises of eternal unity in exchange for their humanity. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Mia broke the silence. "We can't keep running from this," she said, her voice steady but laced with fear. Daniel looked at her, his heart aching at the determination in her eyes. "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how do we even begin?" Mia reached for the journal, her fingers brushing against its worn cover, and for a moment they both felt a jolt of energy, cold and electric. The crescent moon symbol glowed faintly, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. They spent the next few hours poring over the journal's pages, searching for a way to fulfill the ritual's demands without losing themselves completely. The instructions were cryptic. filled with symbols and incantations they didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. The ritual required mutual consent. Both of them had to willingly give their lives for the bond to be unbroken. The idea was horrifying, but the journal promised an afterlife together, a union unmarred by time or mortality. "It's the only way," Mia said, her voice trembling. "We either do this, or we let it destroy us." Daniel hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. He loved Mia more than anything, but the idea of ending her life or letting her end his was unbearable. Yet, the alternative was just as terrifying. The accidents, the whispers, the shadows, it was all linked to the ritual, and it wouldn't stop until they fulfilled its demands. "What if it's a trick?" he asked, his voice strained. "What if we do this, and there's nothing on the other side?" Mia took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We have to trust each other," she said. "That's all we have left." That night, they made a pact. They would perform the ritual together, each of them holding a blade, their fates intertwined. The journal provided the exact time and location, the abandoned chapel where it had all begun. As they prepared, the air grew thick with tension, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Mia packed the ritual objects into a bag, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. Daniel watched her, his heart breaking at the thought of what they were about to do. But there was no turning back. The ritual had claimed them, and they had no choice but to see it through. The chapel was as they remembered it, its crumbling walls and shattered stained glass windows casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. They set up the altar, arranging the objects as instructed, the crescent moon symbol glowing faintly in the darkness. The air inside was cold, the silence deafening, and the weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. Mia lit the candles, their flames casting flickering light on the walls, as Daniel recited the incantation. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled, the words echoing through the chapel like a death knell. As they stood before the altar, blades in hand, the whispers returned, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery. "Now or never," Mia said, her voice trembling but resolute. Daniel nodded, though his heart was breaking. They raised their blades, the moonlight reflecting off the steel, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The journal's words echoed in their minds, the promise of eternal love calling to them like a siren's song. But as they prepared to strike, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging them into darkness. The chapel filled with shadows, their forms twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible yet filled with malice. Mia and Daniel clutched their blades, their hearts pounding as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The crescent moon symbol pulsed with an unnatural light, its glow intensifying with each passing second. "We have to finish it," Mia shouted over the cacophony. Daniel nodded, though fear gripped him like a vice. They raised their blades once more, the weight of their pact driving them forward. But as they brought the blades down, something stopped them. A force, cold and unyielding, held their hands in place, the blades inches from each other's chests. The shadows coalesced into a single figure, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the chapel, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond requires blood," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price must be paid willingly." Mia and Daniel stared at the figure, their breaths shallow, their hearts racing. The ritual's true nature was revealed. It wasn't just about death, but about sacrifice and surrender. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving them standing in the darkness, their blades still poised to strike. The candles relit themselves, their flames casting flickering light on the altar. Mia and Daniel lowered their blades, their hands trembling, the weight of the ritual's demands heavier than ever. "We have to do it," Mia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. But not like this. It has to be real, not forced. Daniel nodded, though the thought of ending her life or letting her end his was unbearable. But the pact had been made, and there was no turning back. They returned to the apartment, the journal tucked into Mia's bag, its presence a constant reminder of their decision. The whispers lingered, the shadows followed, and the weight of the ritual pressed down on them. They tried to go on with their lives, but the pact had changed everything. It was only a matter of time before one of them acted, the bond demanding its price. The pact was made, but the ritual was far from over. The tension between them was unbearable, every glance and word loaded with unspoken meaning. They moved through the days like strangers, the weight of the pact suffocating them. The journal sat untouched on the table, its presence a constant reminder of the decision they had made. Mia tried to focus on the mundane cooking, cleaning, anything to distract herself, but the whispers followed her, their voices a relentless chorus of doubt and temptation. Daniel retreated into silence, his mind a battlefield of fear and resolve. The ritual had changed them, driving a wedge between them that neither could bridge. The shadows in the apartment grew darker, their forms more defined, as if the ritual's influence was strengthening. Mia would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Daniel began to feel a presence in the room, cold and unyielding, its gaze fixed on him. The whispers became more insistent, their words more coherent, urging them to act. "The bond requires blood," they hissed. "You promised. You swore." Mia and Daniel tried to ignore them, but the voices were everywhere, filling the air with their demands. One night, as Mia lay in bed, she felt a hand on her shoulder, its touch icy and unnatural. She turned to see Daniel standing over her, his eyes glassy and unfocused, a knife in his hand. She screamed, scrambling out of bed, and he seemed to snap out of it, dropping the knife with a look of horror. "I don't remember picking it up," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mia didn't respond, her mind racing with the realization that the ritual was no longer content to wait, it was forcing their hand. The incidents became more frequent, each one more violent than the last. Daniel would wake up to find deep scratches on his arms, the wounds fresh and angry. Mia would find her clothes torn, her skin marred with bruises she couldn't explain. The apartment, once their sanctuary, had become a battleground, every corner hiding a new threat. They tried to leave, to escape the ritual's influence, but the journal's pull was inescapable. It was as if the ritual had bound them to the apartment, its dark energy seeping into the very walls. One evening, as they sat in silence, Mia broke down. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her voice choked with tears. "The ritual is killing us, one way or another. We have to end it." Daniel looked at her, his heart breaking at the desperation in her eyes. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia reached for the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its pages. "The bond requires blood," she read aloud, her voice shaking. "But it has to be real. We have to mean it." They sat together, the journal open between them, the crescent moon symbol glowing faintly in the dim light. The weight of their decision pressed down on them, the air heavy with tension. "We have to do it," Mia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Not because the ritual wants us to, but because we choose to. Because we love each other." Daniel nodded, though the thought of ending her life or letting her end his was unbearable. But the pact had been made, and there was no turning back. They prepared the altar once more, arranging the ritual objects as instructed. The chapel was cold, the air thick with anticipation, as they stood before the altar, blades in hand. The whispers returned, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, but Mia and Daniel ignored them. This was their choice, their decision, and they would see it through. They raised their blades, their eyes locked, the weight of their love and the ritual's demands intertwining. As they brought the blades down, time seemed to slow, the world around them fading into darkness. The crescent moon symbol pulsed with an unnatural light, its glow enveloping them in a crimson haze. They felt a sharp pain in their chests, as if something were clawing its way into their hearts, and for a moment they were consumed by blinding light. When it faded, they were no longer in the chapel, but in a place of endless shadows and whispers, the air heavy with the scent of blood. The figure from before stood before them, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price has been paid." Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the ritual's demands heavier than ever. They had fulfilled the pact, but at what cost? As the figure disappeared, they felt a strange warmth spreading through their bodies, the pain in their chests fading. The shadows around them deepened, their forms twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, and for a moment they thought they saw a glimmer of light in the distance. But it was fleeting, the darkness closing in around them, the ritual's influence unrelenting. They stood together in the void, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The bond had been sealed, but the price had been steep. They had chosen eternal unity, but at the cost of their humanity. The whispers lingered, the shadows followed, and the weight of the ritual's demands hung heavy in the air. They had fallen, but the ritual was far from over. The fall was only the beginning. The void was endless, a sea of shadows and whispers that stretched into infinity. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, the warmth of their bond the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The figure was gone, but its words lingered in their minds, a reminder of the price they had paid. The ritual had changed them, stripping away their humanity and leaving them adrift in this strange, shifting realm. The air was heavy with the scent of blood, the whispers a constant, insistent presence, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery. They began to explore the void, their steps hesitant, their eyes searching for anything that might explain where they were. The ground beneath their feet shifted like sand, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. The whispers grew louder as they moved, their words more coherent, urging them to embrace the darkness. "You are one now," they hissed. "The bond is unbreakable, but the price is eternal." Mia and Daniel tried to ignore them, but the voices were everywhere, filling the air with their demands. The void seemed to respond to their thoughts, the shadows shifting to mirror their emotions. When they felt fear, the darkness grew thicker, suffocating. When they felt love, the shadows receded, the whispers softening. It was as if the void was a reflection of their bond, its shape and form dictated by their connection. They clung to each other, their bond their only anchor in this strange, shifting realm. But even as they moved forward, they couldn't shake the feeling that the void was watching them, waiting for them to falter. They began to see images of their past, twisted and distorted, as if the void was trying to manipulate them. Daniel saw Mia's face, her eyes cold and unfeeling, her hands stained with blood. Mia saw Daniel standing over her, a knife in his hand, his expression blank and lifeless. The images were fleeting, but they left a mark, their minds haunted by the questions they raised. Were these visions of what could have been, or were they warnings of what was yet to come? The whispers grew louder, their words more insidious, as they tried to plant seeds of doubt. "The bond is unbreakable," they hissed, "but love is fragile. One wrong move, and it will shatter." Mia and Daniel tried to block them out, but the voices were relentless, their words a constant reminder of the fragility of their bond. They clung to each other, their love their only defense against the void's manipulations. But even as they held on, They couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was closing in. They began to feel a pull, a force drawing them deeper into the void. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker, as they moved toward its source. The whispers became a roar, their voices a cacophony of chaos and temptation. "The bond is eternal," they screamed. "But the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel hesitated, their hearts pounding, the weight of the void pressing down on them. They had come this far, but the path ahead was uncertain, the price of their bond still unclear. The source of the pull was a vast, swirling vortex, its edges crackling with dark energy. The air around it was thick with the scent of decay, the whispers deafening. Mia and Daniel stood at its edge, their hands clasped tightly, their eyes locked. The bond was unbreakable, but the void demanded more. "We have to go in," Mia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Daniel nodded, though his heart was breaking. The void had claimed them, and there was no turning back. They stepped into the vortex, the darkness enveloping them in a cold, suffocating embrace. The world around them shifted, the void transforming into a vast, twisting labyrinth. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the walls pulsating with dark energy. The whispers were louder here, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, as they urged them forward. Mia and Daniel moved through the labyrinth, their bond their only guide, the weight of the void pressing down on them. The labyrinth seemed endless, its corridors twisting and turning, the walls shifting as they moved. The whispers grew louder, their words more insidious, as they tried to manipulate them. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But love is fleeting." Mia and Daniel tried to ignore them, but the voices were relentless, their words a constant reminder of the fragility of their bond. They clung to each other, their love their only defense against the void's manipulations. But even as they held on, they couldn't shake the feeling that the labyrinth was closing in. They began to see glimpses of the outside world, their apartment, the chapel, the journal, but the images were fleeting, distorted. It was as if the void was taunting them, showing them what they had lost. "The bond is eternal," the whispers hissed. "But the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel pressed on, their hearts pounding, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on them. They had come this far, but the path ahead was uncertain, the price of their bond still unclear. The labyrinth ended abruptly, the walls giving way to a vast, open space. At its center stood the figure from before, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price has been paid." Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the void pressing down on them. They had fulfilled the pact, but at what cost? The void was endless, the price infinite, and the bond unbreakable. The labyrinth stretched out before them, its walls twisting and shifting like living things. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, the whispers a constant, insistent presence. Mia and Daniel moved forward, their hands clasped tightly, their bond the only thing guiding them through the maze. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, their surfaces slick and cold to the touch. The labyrinth responded to their emotions, the corridors shifting to mirror their fears and doubts. Every step forward felt like a battle, the void watching and waiting for them to falter. The whispers grew louder as they moved deeper into the labyrinth, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But love is fragile." Mia tried to block them out, focusing on the warmth of Daniel's hand in hers, but the voices were relentless. Daniel's grip tightened, his eyes scanning the twisting corridors ahead. The labyrinth seemed endless, its walls closing in around them, the darkness suffocating. They pressed on, their bond their only anchor in this chaotic, shifting realm. The walls began to change, their surfaces shifting to reveal images from Mia and Daniel's past. They saw glimpses of happy moments, laughter, embraces, shared smiles, but these were quickly overshadowed by darker memories. Fights, tears, broken promises. The images were fleeting but vivid, their minds haunted by the questions they raised. Were these visions meant to remind them of their bond's strength? Or were they designed to break them? The whispers didn't answer, their voices a cacophony of chaos and temptation. They came to a fork in the path, two corridors stretching out before them. The whispers grew louder, their words more insidious, as they urged them to choose. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But one wrong move, and it will shatter." Mia and Daniel hesitated, their eyes locked, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They chose the left path, their steps hesitant, the walls closing in around them. The corridor twisted and turned, the air growing heavier with each step, the whispers deafening. They began to feel a pull, a force drawing them deeper into the labyrinth. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the walls pulsating with dark energy. The whispers became a roar, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, as they urged them forward. Mia and Daniel clung to each other, their love their only defense against the darkness. But even as they pressed on, they couldn't shake the feeling that the labyrinth was testing them, its challenges designed to break their bond. The corridor ended abruptly, the walls giving way to a vast, open space. At its center stood a mirror, its surface dark and unyielding. The whispers fell silent as they approached, the air heavy with anticipation. Mia and Daniel stood before the mirror, their reflections distorted and twisted. The mirror seemed to pulse with dark energy, its surface rippling like water. They hesitated, their hearts pounding, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on them. The mirror was a test, but of what, they didn't know. Mia reached out to touch the mirror's surface, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The ripples spread outward, the mirror's surface shifting to reveal a vision of their future together. They saw themselves standing hand in hand, their bond unbroken, but the image was fleeting. The mirror's surface darkened once more, the whispers returning with renewed vigor. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel stepped back, the weight of the vision pressing down on them. They pressed on, the labyrinth's corridors twisting and turning, the walls pulsating with dark energy. The whispers grew louder, their words more insidious, as they tried to manipulate them. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But love is fleeting." Mia and Daniel tried to ignore them, but the voices were relentless, their words a constant reminder of the fragility of their bond. They clung to each other, their love their only defense against the void's manipulations. The labyrinth seemed endless, its corridors twisting and turning, the walls shifting as they moved. The air grew heavier, the darkness suffocating, as they moved deeper into its depths. They began to see glimpses of the outside world, their apartment, the chapel, the journal, but the images were fleeting and distorted. It was as if the labyrinth was taunting them, showing them what they had lost. "The bond is eternal," the whispers hissed. "But the price is infinite." They came to another fork in the path, two corridors stretching out before them. The whispers grew louder, their words more insidious, as they urged them to choose. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But one wrong move, and it will shatter." Mia and Daniel hesitated, their eyes locked, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They chose the right path, their steps hesitant, the walls closing in around them. The corridor twisted and turned, the air growing heavier with each step, the whispers deafening. The corridor ended abruptly, the walls giving way to another vast, open space. At its center stood the figure from before, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. But the price has been paid. Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on them. They had fulfilled the pact, but at what cost? The labyrinth was endless, the price infinite, and the bond unbreakable. The mirror stood at the center of the open space, its surface dark and unyielding. The air around it was heavy with anticipation, the whispers eerily silent. Mia and Daniel approached it cautiously, their hands still clasped tightly, the bond between them their only anchor. The mirror's surface rippled as they drew closer, its reflections distorted and shifting, as if it were alive. They could see themselves in its depths, but the images were wrong, twisted versions of who they were, their features contorted into grotesque masks. The silence was deafening, the weight of the mirror's presence pressing down on them. Mia reached out to touch the mirror, her fingers trembling as they brushed against its cold surface. The ripples spread outward, the reflection distorting further, until it was no longer their faces staring back at them. Instead, they saw the chapel, the altar, the journal, the blades. The image was vivid, almost tangible, and it pulled them in, their minds drawn into its depths. The whispers returned, their voices soft and insidious, as they urged them to relive the moment. "The bond requires blood," they murmured. But was it worth the price? The vision shifted, showing them standing together in the chapel, their blades poised to strike. But this time, they hesitated, their hands trembling as the weight of their decision bore down on them. The whispers grew louder, their words more insistent, as they tried to sway them. "You made a pact," they hissed. "But was it truly your choice?" Mia and Daniel watched as their reflections faltered, their bond wavering under the pressure. The mirror was testing them, forcing them to confront doubts they had buried deep within. The image changed again, this time showing them in the labyrinth, their bond strained to its breaking point. They saw themselves arguing, their words sharp and venomous, the whispers exploiting every crack in their connection. "Love is fragile," the voices murmured. "One wrong move, and it will shatter." Mia and Daniel clung to each other, the warmth of their bond the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The mirror's surface rippled violently, the reflections shifting once more, revealing a future they couldn't bear to face. They saw themselves standing alone, their bond broken, the ritual's price still unpaid. The chapel loomed in the background, its walls crumbling, the journal's pages burning to ash. The whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, as they urged them to give in. "The bond is eternal," they hissed. "But the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel stepped back from the mirror, the weight of its visions pressing down on them. The reflections faded, the mirror's surface returning to its dark, unyielding state. The whispers fell silent once more, the air heavy with anticipation. Mia and Daniel stood before the mirror, their hands still clasped tightly, their bond the only thing keeping them grounded. The mirror was a test, but of what, they weren't sure. It had shown them their fears, their doubts, and the fragility of their bond, but it had also reminded them of their strength. They had faced the darkness together, and they would do so again. The mirror's surface rippled faintly, its reflections shifting one last time, revealing a glimmer of light in the distance. They moved toward the light, their steps hesitant, the mirror's presence fading behind them. The labyrinth's corridors twisted and turned, the walls pulsating with dark energy, but the light grew stronger with each step. The whispers returned, their voices soft and insidious, as they urged them to turn back. "The bond is eternal," they murmured, "but the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel ignored them, their eyes fixed on the light, their bond guiding them forward. The labyrinth seemed endless, but they pressed on, their love their only defense against the darkness. The light grew brighter as they neared its source, the air growing warmer, the darkness receding. They came to another open space, its center marked by a single, glowing figure. It was the same figure from before, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price has been paid." Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on them. The figure stepped aside, revealing a passageway bathed in golden light. The whispers fell silent, the air growing lighter as they approached. The passageway seemed to stretch into infinity, its walls lined with images of their past, their bond unbroken and their love eternal. The figure watched them, its presence heavy and unyielding, as they stepped into the light. The warmth enveloped them, the darkness of the labyrinth fading behind them, the weight of the void lifting. They moved forward, their steps confident, their bond stronger than ever. The passageway ended abruptly, the light giving way to a vast, open plain. The air was warm and sweet, the sky a deep, endless blue. The whispers were gone, the darkness of the void a distant memory. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond unbroken. The figure was gone, but its words lingered in their minds, a reminder of the price they had paid. They had faced the labyrinth, the mirror, and the void, and they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. The plain stretched out before them, its beauty a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. They moved forward, their steps light, their hearts filled with love. The bond was eternal, the price infinite, but they had each other, and that was enough. The mirror's test was behind them, but the journey was far from over. They had faced the darkness, and they would do so again, their bond their only guide. The light was warm, path ahead uncertain, but they moved forward together, their bond unbroken. The golden light surrounded them, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold void they had left behind. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond unbroken. The plain stretched out before them, its beauty almost overwhelming, the air filled with a sense of peace. The whispers were gone, the darkness of the labyrinth a distant memory, but the weight of the ritual's price still lingered. They moved forward, their steps light, their hearts filled with a fragile hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they felt free. The plain seemed endless, its rolling hills bathed in the golden light, the sky a deep, endless blue. The air was sweet and clear, the shadows of the void far behind them. Mia and Daniel walked in silence, the warmth of the light soothing their weary souls. The bond between them felt stronger here, as if the light was nourishing it, filling the cracks the void had left behind. But even as they moved forward, they couldn't shake the feeling that the light was testing them, its beauty a challenge to their resolve. They began to see glimpses of their past again, but this time, the images were different. They saw themselves laughing, their faces filled with joy, their bond unbreakable. The images were fleeting but vivid, their minds filled with a sense of peace. The light seemed to be reminding them of what they had fought for, the love that had carried them through the darkness. The whispers were gone, but the memories were enough, their bond stronger than ever. They came to a small stream, its water clear and sparkling, the light reflecting off its surface. Mia knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cool water, the sensation grounding her. Daniel knelt beside her, their reflections staring back at them, their faces filled with a quiet strength. The light seemed to pulse around them, its warmth enveloping them in a sense of calm. They drank from the stream, the water sweet and refreshing, their spirits lifted. The plain stretched out before them, its beauty a reminder of the peace they had found. They pressed on, the light guiding their steps, the air growing warmer with each passing moment. The plain seemed to respond to their emotions, its beauty intensifying as their bond grew stronger. They began to feel a pull, a gentle force drawing them forward, as if the light itself was calling to them. The path ahead was uncertain, but they moved with confidence, their bond unbroken. The light was warm, the path ahead clear, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. They came to a grove of trees, their branches heavy with golden fruit, the light filtering through their leaves. The air was filled with a sweet, intoxicating scent, the grove a place of peace and tranquility. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond stronger than ever. The light seemed to pulse around them, its warmth filling their hearts with a sense of joy. They picked the fruit, its sweetness a reminder of the peace they had found. They pressed on, the light guiding their steps, the air growing warmer with each passing moment. The plain seemed to respond to their emotions, its beauty intensifying as their bond grew stronger. They began to feel a pull, a gentle force drawing them forward, as if the light itself was calling to them. The path ahead was uncertain, but they moved with confidence, their bond unbroken. The light was warm, the path ahead clear, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. The plain began to change, its rolling hills giving way to a vast, open field. The light grew brighter, its warmth almost overwhelming, as they approached its source. The air was filled with a sense of peace, the shadows of the void far behind them. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond stronger than ever. The light seemed to pulse around them, its warmth filling their hearts with a sense of joy. They came to a small hill, its summit bathed in the golden light, the air filled with a sense of peace. Mia and Daniel climbed it together, their steps light, their hearts filled with hope. The light seemed to pulse around them, its warmth filling their hearts with a sense of joy. They reached the summit, the plain stretching out before them, its beauty almost overwhelming. The light was warm, the path ahead clear, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. The plain stretched out before them, its beauty a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. They moved forward, their steps light, their hearts filled with love. The bond was eternal, the price infinite, but they had each other, and that was enough. The mirror's test was behind them, but the journey was far from over. They had faced the darkness, and they would do so again, their bond their only guide. The light was warm, the path ahead uncertain, but they moved forward together, their bond unbroken. The light began to dim as they moved forward, the golden plain giving way to a darker, more somber landscape. The air grew colder, the warmth that had surrounded them fading into a faint memory. Mia and Daniel clung to each other, their bond unbroken but strained under the weight of the shifting terrain. The whispers returned, their voices soft and insidious, as they murmured about the price they had paid. The path ahead was uncertain, the light of the plain a distant memory, but they pressed on, their bond their only guide. The landscape became barren, the rolling hills replaced by jagged rocks and twisted trees. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the shadows creeping closer with each step. Mia and Daniel moved cautiously, their hands clasped tightly, their bond the only thing keeping them grounded. The whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, as they reminded them of the ritual's cost. "The bond is eternal," they hissed, "but the price is infinite." The weight of those words pressed down on them, their steps faltering as they moved deeper into the darkness. They came to a cliff, its edge jagged and crumbling, the void stretching out below them. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the whispers deafening as they urged them to take the final step. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond unbroken. The void seemed to call to them, its darkness a reminder of the price they had paid. They hesitated, their hearts pounding, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them. The whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of chaos and temptation, as they urged them to embrace the void. "The bond is eternal," they screamed, "but the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel clung to each other, their love their only defense against the darkness. The void seemed to pulse around them, its shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. They stood at the edge, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them, but they couldn't bring themselves to take the final step. The figure appeared once more, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price has been paid." Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them. The figure stepped aside, revealing a path bathed in golden light. The whispers fell silent, the air growing lighter as they approached. They stepped into the light, its warmth enveloping them, the darkness of the void fading behind them. The path stretched out before them, its golden light a stark contrast to the shadows they had left behind. Mia and Daniel moved forward, their steps light, their hearts filled with a fragile hope. The bond was eternal, the price infinite, but they had each other, and that was enough. The figure was gone, but its words lingered in their minds, a reminder of the cost they had paid. The light began to dim as they moved forward, the golden path giving way to a darker, more somber landscape. The air grew colder, the warmth that had surrounded them fading into a faint memory. Mia and Daniel clung to each other, their bond unbroken but strained under the weight of the shifting terrain. The whispers returned, their voices soft and insidious, as they murmured about the price they had paid. The path ahead was uncertain, the light of the plain a distant memory, but they pressed on, their bond their only guide. The landscape became barren, the rolling hills replaced by jagged rocks and twisted trees. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the shadows creeping closer with each step. Mia and Daniel moved cautiously, their hands clasped tightly, their bond the only thing keeping them grounded. The whispers grew louder, their voices a mix of encouragement and mockery, as they reminded them of the ritual's cost. "The bond is eternal," they hissed, "but the price is infinite." The weight of those words pressed down on them, their steps faltering as they moved deeper into the darkness. They came to a cliff, its edge jagged and crumbling, the void stretching out below them. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the whispers deafening as they urged them to take the final step. Mia and Daniel stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their bond unbroken. The void seemed to call to them, its darkness a reminder of the price they had paid. They hesitated, their hearts pounding, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them. The whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of chaos and temptation, as they urged them to embrace the void. "The bond is eternal," they screamed, "but the price is infinite." Mia and Daniel clung to each other, their love their only defense against the darkness. The void seemed to pulse around them, its shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. They stood at the edge, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them, but they couldn't bring themselves to take the final step. The figure appeared once more, tall and imposing, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice boomed through the void, deep and resonant, as it spoke. "The bond is unbroken," it said, its words echoing in their minds. "But the price has been paid." Mia and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts pounding, the weight of the ritual's cost pressing down on them. The figure stepped aside, revealing a path bathed in golden light. The whispers fell silent, the air growing lighter as they approached. They stepped into the light, its warmth enveloping them, the darkness of the void fading behind them. The path stretched out before them, its golden light a stark contrast to the shadows they had left behind. Mia and Daniel moved forward, their steps light, their hearts filled with a fragile hope. The bond was eternal, the price infinite, but they had each other, and that was enough. The figure was gone, but its words lingered in their minds, a reminder of the cost they had paid. "Your admirer." The first letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day where the air felt sharp and the sunlight seemed to cut through the trees like a knife. It was tucked neatly into her mailbox, an unassuming white envelope with no return address. Her name, Isabel, was written in a flowing, elegant script that seemed almost old-fashioned. She tore it open, curiosity piqued. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words, "Dearest Isabel," scrawled across the top in the same elegant handwriting. The letter spoke of her beauty, her grace, her laughter. It was filled with compliments that bordered on poetic, but something about it made her skin crawl. It was signed simply, "Your admirer." At first, Isabel brushed it off. Perhaps it was a prank, or maybe a shy coworker had finally worked up the courage to express their feelings. But as the days passed, the letters kept coming. Each one was more detailed than the last, recounting moments from her life that no stranger should have known. The way she tied her hair up when she was working, the way she hummed to herself while cooking, even the book she was reading. Whoever this admirer was, they were watching her. She tried to ignore them, tossing them into the trash or locking them away in a drawer, but they kept appearing on her doorstep, in her car, even tucked into her grocery bag. The letters grew more intense, more personal. Your admirer began to speak of their longing, their obsession. "I dream of the day you'll be mine," one letter read. "No one else deserves you. No one else understands you like I do." Isabel's unease turned to fear. She started locking her doors at night, checking the shadows as she walked to her car. Her fiancé, Liam, noticed the change in her. "You've been jumpy lately," he said one evening, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything okay?" Isabel hesitated, then showed him the letters. He frowned as he read them, his jaw tightening. "This is sick," he muttered. "We need to report this." But Isabel shook her head. "What if it's just some harmless weirdo?" she said. "I don't want to make a big deal out of it." Liam disagreed, but he respected her decision. That night, Isabel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt too quiet, too still. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting. She got up to check the locks again, her heart pounding in her chest. As she peered out the window, she saw a shadow move in the distance. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was it just her imagination? Or was your admirer closer than she thought? The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was different. The handwriting was sharper, more urgent. "You're avoiding me," it read. "You don't understand. You're mine. You've always been mine. I won't let anyone take you from me, not even him." Isabel's hands trembled as she read the words. Whoever this person was, they knew about Liam. They were threatening him. She called the police, but they brushed it off. "Without a threat of violence, there's not much we can do," the officer said. "Just keep an eye out and call us if anything escalates." Isabel hung up, frustrated and afraid. She started carrying pepper spray in her purse and avoided going out alone at night. A week later, she received another letter. This one was short and chilling. "Soon, you'll see that I'm the only one who truly loves you. They will all fall away. Even him." Isabel's blood ran cold. She showed it to Liam, who immediately insisted they go to the police again. But before they could, tragedy struck. Late that night, Isabel was woken by the sound of her phone ringing. It was the police. Liam had been found dead, his body discovered in an alley not far from their apartment. The officer's voice was grim as he delivered the news. Isabel collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be true. The next morning, another letter arrived. "Now you're free," it read. "Now you can be mine." Isabel's grief turned to rage. Whoever this person was, They had taken Liam from her. She vowed to find them, to make them pay. But little did she know, the truth was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. The days that followed were a blur. Isabel's life had become a waking nightmare, haunted by the letters and the shadowy figure who seemed to be always watching. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being hunted, that every step she took was being monitored. The letters kept coming, each one more sinister than the last. She began to piece together the clues, searching for any hint of the admirer's identity. The letters were postmarked from different locations, but always handwritten, always personal. She started to suspect that it was someone she knew, someone close to her. But who? And why? Isabel's paranoia grew, her nights sleepless, her days consumed by fear. She felt like she was losing herself, drowning in the darkness that had invaded her life. But she refused to give up. She would find the truth, no matter the cost, even if it meant confronting the shadow that haunted her every waking moment. The days following Liam's death were a blur. Isabel moved through them in a daze, her heart heavy with grief and her mind clouded with unanswered questions. The police had ruled his death a homicide, but they had no suspects, no leads. Just a body in an alley and a case that was growing colder by the day. Isabel couldn't accept it. She couldn't let it go. She started noticing things, small things that made her skin crawl. The sound of footsteps behind her when she walked to her car. The flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. The feeling that someone was watching her, even when she was alone. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, her grief playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. One evening, as she sat on the couch staring at the TV without really watching it, she heard a noise outside. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft scrape against the window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she got up and crept toward the window, her breath shallow. She pulled back the curtain and peered into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. Just the empty street and the faint glow of the streetlights. But then movement. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, stepping into the light for just a moment before disappearing again. Isabel gasped and backed away from the window, her hands trembling. Whoever it was, they were out there, watching her. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the shadow was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one officer asked, his tone skeptical. Isabel nodded, her voice shaking. "I know what I saw," she said. The officer nodded, but she could tell he didn't believe her. After they left, Isabel locked the doors and windows and turned on every light in the house. She sat on the couch, clutching a knife in one hand and her phone in the other, and waited. She didn't sleep that night. She just sat there, staring at the shadows and wondering if they were staring back. The next morning, she received another letter. "You saw me," it read. "You know I'm here. I'll always be here. Watching. Waiting." Isabel's hands shook as she read the words. Whoever this person was, they were getting bolder. And they were getting closer. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a security camera and installed it outside her front door. She started carrying a taser in her purse and a baseball bat by her bed. She refused to be a victim. Not again. But no matter what she did, the shadow kept coming. She would see it out of the corner of her eye, fleeting and intangible, but always there. It was like a ghost, haunting her every step. She started to wonder if she was losing her mind. One night, as she was lying in bed trying to sleep, she heard the scrape against the window again. This time, she didn't move. She just lay there, her heart pounding in her chest, and listened. The scrape came again, louder this time. Then silence. Isabel held her breath, waiting, and then she heard it. A voice, soft and low, whispering her name. Isabel. She bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. The voice was coming from outside her window. She grabbed her phone and the baseball bat and crept toward the window, her hands trembling. She pulled back the curtain and saw him. A figure standing in the shadows, his face obscured. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that made her blood run cold. He just stood there, staring at her, his eyes glinting in the darkness. Before she could react, he turned and disappeared into the night. Isabel collapsed to the floor, her heart racing. She knew now that she wasn't imagining things. The shadow was real, and he was coming for her. The morning after the shadow appeared at her window, Isabel woke with a start, her heart pounding as if she'd been running in her sleep. The room was silent, the curtains drawn tight to block out the world, but the memory of the night before lingered like a dark cloud. She reached for her phone, checking the security camera feed she'd set up outside her front door. Nothing unusual, just the quiet street and the occasional passing car. But the feeling of being watched refused to leave her. She went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind racing. Last night's encounter had confirmed her worst fears. Your admirer wasn't just a distant threat. He was here, in her life, in her space. She couldn't shake the image of that figure standing outside her window, his presence both menacing and intimate. She needed answers, but where could she even start? The police had been no help, dismissing her concerns as paranoia. She couldn't blame them without evidence. Her story sounded like the ramblings of a grieving woman. But she knew what she'd seen. She knew the letters were real. And she knew Liam's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was connected to your admirer. She could feel it in her bones. Determined to take action, Isabel decided to revisit the alley where Liam had been found. Maybe there was something the police had missed, some clue that would lead her to the truth. The thought of going back there made her stomach churn, but she pushed the fear aside. If she wanted answers, she needed to face the darkness head-on. The alley was exactly as she remembered it, narrow, dimly lit, and reeking of decay. The bloodstain on the pavement was still faintly visible, a grim reminder of what had happened here. Isabel's breath hitched as she stepped closer, her hands trembling at her sides. She forced herself to focus, scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. Her eyes landed on a crumpled piece of paper wedged between a dumpster and the wall. She hesitated before reaching for it, her heart pounding as she unfolded it. It was a letter, the handwriting unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here," it read. "This place is cursed. Just like you are. Just like he was. But don't worry, my love. I'll save you from the darkness." Isabel's hands shook as she read the words. He knew she was here. He was watching her now. She stuffed the letter into her pocket and turned to leave, her eyes darting around the alley as she hurried back to the street. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if invisible eyes were tracking her every move. She broke into a jog, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't stop until she was safely back in her car, the doors locked and the engine running. When she got home, she locked herself inside and immediately checked the security camera feed. The street outside was quiet, but something caught her eye, a figure standing at the edge of the frame, just out of focus. She zoomed in, her heart sinking as she recognized the broad shoulders and the way he stood. It was him. He'd followed her. The realization sent a wave of panic through her. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. "You need to come now," she said. "He's outside my house. He's been stalking me." The operator assured her they'd send someone. But Isabel knew it wouldn't be fast enough. She could feel him closing in, his presence like a shadow creeping over her. She grabbed the baseball bat from beside her bed and stood by the front door, her heart pounding as she waited. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. And then a knock. Soft but deliberate. Isabel froze, her grip tightening on the bat. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just another knock. Louder this time. Isabel's mind raced. Should she open the door? Should she wait for the police? The knock came again, sharper now, more urgent. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her hand hovering over the lock. Before she could decide what to do, the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the house, heavy and suffocating. Isabel hesitated, then peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. She let out a shaky breath and unlocked the door, stepping outside to look around. The street was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. But as she turned to go back inside, she noticed something on the doorstep, a small, neatly wrapped box. Her stomach dropped as she picked it up, her hands trembling as she untied the ribbon. Inside was a single red rose and a note. "Soon, my love. Soon." The rose sat on the kitchen table, its deep red petals a stark contrast to the sterile white of the room. Isabel couldn't bring herself to throw it away, though she knew she should. It was a reminder of everything she'd lost, everything she was still losing. The note lay beside it, the words, "Soon, my love." Soon etched into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever your admirer had planned was closer than she wanted to admit. She spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, jumping at every sound and scrutinizing every shadow. The security camera footage showed nothing unusual, but Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, just out of sight. She started to question her own sanity, wondering if the grief and stress were making her imagine things. But then the letters started again. They arrived at random times, slipped under her door or left on her car seat. Each one was more disturbing than the last, filled with declarations of love and promises of possession. "You're mine, Isabel," one read. "You've always been mine. Soon, you'll understand that." She tried to ignore them, to focus on finding a way out of this nightmare, but they were inescapable. Her only solace came in the form of her best friend, Maya. They'd known each other since childhood, and Maya had been her rock through everything. When Isabel told her about the letters and the shadowy figure, Maya didn't dismiss her concerns. "This is serious," she said, her voice firm. "You can't handle this alone. Let me help you." Together, they began to piece together the puzzle. Isabel shared every detail she could remember, from the first letter to the rose on her doorstep. Maya suggested they start by analyzing the letters themselves, looking for any clues that might reveal your admirer's identity. They spent hours poring over the notes, searching for patterns or hidden meanings. One letter stood out. It mentioned a park Isabel used to visit as a child, a place she hadn't thought about in years. "I've always loved watching you there," it read. "You were so carefree, so beautiful. I knew then that you were mine." Isabel's blood ran cold. Whoever this person was, they'd been watching her for a long time. Maya insisted they visit the park, hoping it might trigger more memories or reveal some clue. Isabel hesitated but agreed, desperate for any lead. The park was smaller than she remembered, the once bustling playground now quiet and overgrown. As they walked through it, Isabel felt a strange sense of unease, as if the past was reaching out to grab her. They stopped by a bench near the old oak tree, the one Isabel used to climb as a child. "Do you remember anything unusual?" Maya asked. "Anyone who might have been watching you?" Isabel frowned. trying to recall. There had been a man who used to sit on this bench, always reading a book. She'd never thought much of him at the time, but now the memory sent a chill down her spine. As they were about to leave, Maya noticed something tucked into the base of the tree, a small envelope, clean and unmarked. Isabel's stomach dropped as she opened it, her hands trembling. Inside was a photo of herself as a child, playing on the swings. On the back, written in that familiar handwriting, was a simple message, "I've always been with you." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some recent obsession. Your admirer had been a part of her life for years, silently watching, waiting. The thought made her feel sick, violated in a way she couldn't fully describe. Maya put a hand on her shoulder, her expression grim. "We're going to figure this out," she said. "But you can't stay alone. Come stay with me for a while." Isabel nodded, grateful for the offer. She couldn't face another night in that house, not with the shadow lurking just outside her door. They packed a bag and headed to Maya's apartment, hoping to leave the darkness behind. But as they drove away, Isabel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the park, watching them go. He was too far away to see clearly, but she knew it was him. Maya's apartment felt like a sanctuary, a small haven in the storm that had become Isabel's life. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and the smell of lavender candles filled the air. Isabel collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion weighing her down like a heavy blanket. Maya handed her a cup of tea, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We're going to figure this out," Maya said, sitting down beside her. "But you need to tell me everything. Every detail, no matter how small it seems." Isabel nodded, sipping the tea and letting its warmth soothe her frayed nerves. She started from the beginning, recounting the first letter, Liam's death, and the shadowy figure who seemed to always be one step ahead. As she spoke, Maya listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Isabel finished, Maya leaned back, her fingers tapping against the arm of the couch. "This guy's been watching you for years," she said. "He knows your routines, your history, your family. That means he's someone close to you, or at least someone who's managed to get close without you noticing." The thought made Isabel's stomach churn. She'd always thought of herself as cautious, aware of her surroundings. How could someone have been watching her for so long without her ever realizing it? "Who would do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who could hate me this much?" Maya hesitated, then spoke carefully. "It's not about hate," she said. "It's about obsession. This person doesn't hate you, they think they love you. In their mind, they're saving you, protecting you. That's why they targeted Liam. They saw him as a threat." Isabel's hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles white. The thought of Liam, so kind and loving, being taken from her because of some twisted delusion made her blood boil. "I need to stop them," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I can't let them ruin anyone else's life." Maya nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll stop them," she said. "But we have to be smart about it. This person's dangerous, and they're not going to just walk away. We need to catch them in the act, gather evidence, and make sure they can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." They spent the rest of the evening brainstorming ideas, trying to piece together a plan. Maya suggested setting a trap, something that would force your admirer out of hiding. Isabel was hesitant. The idea of deliberately putting herself in danger made her skin crawl, but she knew it might be the only way. The next morning, they put their plan into action. Isabel went back to her house, pretending everything was normal. She made a show of going about her day, hoping to lure your admirer into the open. Maya stayed close, watching from a distance and ready to intervene if things went wrong. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Isabel began to wonder if their plan was flawed, if your admirer was smarter than they'd anticipated. But as the sun began to set, she felt that familiar prickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She glanced out the window and saw him. He was standing at the edge of her yard, his face obscured by the shadows. Isabel's heart pounded as she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Maya's number. "He's here," she whispered, "outside the house." Before Maya could respond, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She could hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. She grabbed the baseball bat from beside the door and stood in the hallway, her heart racing. The doorknob rattled, and she froze, her grip tightening on the bat. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The figure stepped into the hallway, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Isabel's grip on the baseball bat tightened, her knuckles white as she raised it defensively. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The man didn't answer, just stood there, his breathing slow and measured. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, keeping her eyes locked on him. She could feel the weight of the bat in her hands, the cold metal reinforcing her resolve. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking under the strain. Still, he didn't move. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until a sudden noise broke at a crash from the kitchen. The figure turned sharply, his head snapping toward the sound. Isabel hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a distraction? Another trap? She didn't have time to think. The lights flickered back on, blinding her for a moment. When her vision cleared, the figure was gone. Isabel's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she scanned the hallway, her bat still raised. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. From the kitchen, she heard footsteps. She gripped the bat tighter and slowly moved toward the noise, her heart pounding with every step. As she rounded the corner, she saw Maya standing by the counter, her phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "Isabel," Maya exclaimed, her eyes wide with relief. "Are you okay? I saw him outside. I tried to get here as fast as I could." Isabel lowered the bat, her hands shaking as she leaned against the wall. "He was inside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was right here." Maya's expression darkened as she stepped closer, putting a comforting hand on Isabel's shoulder. "We need to call the police," she said. "This is beyond us now." Isabel nodded, still trying to catch her breath. She knew Maya was right, but the thought of involving the police again filled her with dread. Would they even believe her this time? Before they could make the call, a noise from the living room made them both freeze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard. Maya grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, her grip firm as she moved toward the sound. Isabel followed close behind, her bat at the ready. The living room was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken threat. Isabel's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the intruder. Then she noticed the French doors leading to the backyard were slightly ajar, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. "He's gone," Maya said, her voice tight with frustration. "He must have slipped out through the back." Isabel's shoulders sagged with a mix of relief and disappointment. They'd been so close, and yet he'd managed to escape again. Maya turned to her, her expression determined. "We're not giving up," she said. "This guy's not as invisible as he thinks he is. We'll find him, Isabel. I promise." Isabel nodded, though her faith was wavering. How many times had they come close only to be outsmarted? They spent the rest of the night securing the house, locking every door and window, and setting up an alarm system. But even as they worked, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that their efforts were futile. Your admirer wasn't just a man, he was a shadow, a phantom who knew how to disappear. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the curtains, exhaustion finally overtook her. She collapsed onto the couch, her body heavy and her mind racing. Maya sat beside her, her presence a small comfort in the chaos. "We'll get through this," Maya said softly. "Together." Isabel wanted to believe her, but the words felt hollow. Your admirer wasn't just a threat, he was a force, an unrelenting presence that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. And as she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could fight him before he won. The next morning, Isabel woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the coffee table. She groaned, her body stiff from sleeping on the couch, and reached for it with a trembling hand. The screen displayed an unknown number, but the message was clear: "You can't hide from me." Her blood ran cold as she stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. She showed the message to Maya, who immediately grabbed her own phone and started dialing the police. "This is enough," Maya said, her voice firm. "They can't ignore this now." Isabel nodded, though she wasn't convinced. The police had let her down before, and she wasn't sure they'd be any more helpful this time. When the officers arrived, they took the message seriously, promising to trace the number and increase patrols in the area. But they also warned her to be cautious, to avoid being alone if possible. Isabel's frustration simmered beneath the surface. What good were precautions when her stalker seemed to know her every move? After the police left, Maya suggested they reach out to Isabel's family and friends, anyone who might have information or could keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Isabel hesitated, not wanting to drag others into her nightmare, but she knew Maya was right. She needed all the help she could get. As they began making calls, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The conversations were strained, the kind of awkwardness that comes from not knowing what to say to someone in crisis. But one call stood out: her cousin Jenna, who she hadn't spoken to in years. Jenna's voice was low and hesitant when she answered, and Isabel could hear the tension in it. I think I might know something," Jenna said after a long pause. "There was this guy. He used to ask about you, back when we were in high school. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. "What guy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenna hesitated before answering, her words slow and deliberate. "His name was Ethan. He was obsessed with you, Isabel. He used to follow you around, take pictures, leave notes in your locker. I thought it was just a crush, but—" The name sent a chill down Isabel's spine. She couldn't remember anyone named Ethan, not clearly, but the description matched your admirer perfectly. "Do you know where he is now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jenna's response was hesitant. "No, but I think he still lives in town. I've seen him around, but I didn't want to say anything." Isabel thanked Jenna and hung up, her mind racing. Ethan. The name felt foreign yet familiar, like a distant memory she couldn't quite grasp. Maya grabbed her laptop and started searching, trying to find anything about Ethan that could help them. Hours later, they had a breakthrough: a social media profile that matched Jenna's description. The picture was grainy, but something about it made Isabel's stomach churn. The man in the photo had a cold, calculating look in his eyes, the kind of gaze that made her skin crawl. Maya suggested they confront him, but Isabel wasn't sure. What if they were wrong? What if this was just another dead end? Maya's determination won out, and they hatched a plan to approach Ethan discreetly, hoping to catch him off guard. They drove to the address listed on his profile, a small, run-down house on the edge of town. The place looked abandoned, the windows dark and the lawn overgrown. Isabel's hands trembled as she stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. As they approached the house, the front door creaked open. A figure stepped out, his face obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the cold, menacing presence. Isabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew without a doubt that this was him. The figure stepped into the dim light, his features finally coming into focus. He was tall and lean, his face sharp and angular with a cold, unsettling intensity in his eyes. Isabel's breath hitched as she recognized him from the photo, though there was something far more menacing about him in person. His gaze locked onto hers, and she felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Isabel," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something dark. "I've been waiting for you." His words sent a wave of dread through her, and she instinctively took a step back. Maya moved closer to her, her posture protective as she glared at him. "Stay back, Ethan," Maya warned, her voice firm. "We know what you've been doing." Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Do you?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "I doubt that. Isabel, you've always been so oblivious. But that's part of why I love you. You're pure, untouched by the ugliness of the world." The way he said it made Isabel's skin crawl, and she gripped Maya's arm tightly. "What do you want from me?" Isabel demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound strong. Ethan tilted his head, his expression almost curious. "You already know," he said softly. "You've always been mine, Isabel. I'm just making sure you understand that now." His words were like a knife, cutting through her fragile resolve. Maya stepped forward, her voice rising in anger. "Leave her alone. You don't get to do this. You don't get to control her life." Ethan's gaze shifted to Maya, and for the first time, his expression darkened. "You're in the way," he said coldly. "But don't worry. I'll take care of that soon enough." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Maya visibly flinched. Isabel's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. They were outnumbered and outmatched, and Ethan's calm demeanor only made him more terrifying. She glanced at Maya, who was still glaring at him, and realized they needed to get out of there fast. "Let's go," Isabel whispered, tugging on Maya's sleeve. Maya hesitated, her protective instincts warring with her fear, but she finally nodded. They turned to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped them in their tracks. "You can't run from me, Isabel," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "I'll always find you." They hurried back to the car, Isabel's hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. Maya kept glancing over her shoulder, her expression tense as she watched the house. "We need to call the police," Maya said as they pulled away. "He's not going to stop, Isabel. We have to do something." Isabel nodded, though her thoughts were a jumbled mess. Ethan's words haunted her, his calm certainty making her feel as if there was no escape. She'd never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of someone else's twisted desires. When they got back to Maya's apartment, they immediately called the police and filed a report. The officers listened carefully, their expressions grim as they took down the details. "We'll look into it," one of them said, "but without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do." Isabel's heart sank at the words, and she fought back tears. Maya put an arm around her, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We'll figure this out," she said. "We won't let him win." Isabel wanted to believe her, but the weight of everything was almost too much to bear. As the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, Isabel sat on the couch, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. Ethan's words echoed in her head, a constant reminder that she wasn't safe, not in her home, not with Maya, not anywhere. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. And until it was, she'd never be free. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Isabel barely slept, her mind too wired with anxiety to rest. Maya did her best to keep her grounded, but even she seemed on edge, her usual calm demeanor fraying under the strain. The police had increased patrols around the apartment, but it did little to ease Isabel's unease. Ethan's threat loomed over her like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, even now. Every time she looked out the window, she half expected to see him standing there, his cold eyes fixed on her. The paranoia was eating away at her, and she knew she couldn't keep living like this. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit apartment, Maya broke the silence. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to make the next move. We have to take control." Isabel nodded, though she wasn't sure what that meant. How could they control a situation that felt so completely out of their hands? Maya leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We need to lure him out," she said. "Set a trap, something that will force him to show his hand. If we can get proof photos, recordings, anything, the police will have no choice but to act." Isabel hesitated, the idea of deliberately putting herself in danger making her stomach churn. But what other choice did they have? They spent the next few hours brainstorming, trying to come up with a plan that would work. Isabel suggested using herself as bait, but Maya shot it down immediately. "Too risky," she said. "If something goes wrong, we won't be able to stop him in time." Instead, they decided to use a decoy, something that would make Ethan think Isabel was alone, vulnerable, but would actually give them the upper hand. The plan was risky, but it was their best shot. They borrowed a friend's car and parked it in a secluded area, making it look as though Isabel had gone for a walk alone. Maya hid nearby, ready to intervene if things went wrong. Isabel waited in the car, her heart pounding as she tried to stay calm. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Just as she was about to give up, she saw him. Ethan emerged from the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate. Isabel's breath caught in her throat as she watched him approach, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She forced herself to stay still, to wait until he was close enough for the trap to work. Ethan reached the car and paused, his eyes scanning the interior. "Isabel," he said, his voice smooth and unsettling, "you shouldn't have come here alone." She didn't respond, her heart racing as she counted the seconds. Before he could do anything, Maya emerged from the shadows, her phone in hand as she recorded everything. "It's over, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "We've got you." For a moment, Ethan looked surprised, but then his expression hardened. He turned to Maya, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between me and Isabel." But Maya didn't back down. She stepped closer, her phone still recording. "It's over," she repeated. "The police are on their way." Ethan's gaze shifted back to Isabel, and for a moment, she thought he might try something. But then he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. The police arrived shortly after Ethan disappeared, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Maya handed over the recording, her hands shaking as she explained what had happened. The officers listened intently, their expressions grim as they reviewed the footage. "This is solid evidence," one of them said. "We'll put out a warrant for his arrest immediately." Isabel felt a flicker of hope, though it was tempered by the lingering fear that Ethan wasn't done yet. He'd slipped away once before, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd do it again. Maya seemed to sense her unease and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We've got him," she said. "He won't be able to hide forever." They returned to the apartment, both exhausted but unable to relax. Isabel's mind was still racing, replaying the confrontation over and over. Ethan's cold, calculating demeanor haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. The next morning, the police called with an update. They'd located Ethan's house and were preparing to execute a search warrant. Isabel's heart leaped at the news, but she couldn't shake the anxiety twisting in her stomach. What if he wasn't there? What if he'd already fled? Maya tried to reassure her, but even she seemed on edge. They spent the day glued to the news, waiting for any updates. Hours passed with no word, and Isabel's nerves grew frayed. She paced the apartment, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to stay calm. Finally, late in the afternoon, the phone rang. Isabel answered it with trembling hands, her heart pounding as the officer on the other end delivered the news. "We found him," he said. "He's in custody." Relief washed over her, so intense it left her lightheaded. She slumped onto the couch, tears streaming down her face as Maya wrapped her in a tight hug. "It's over," Maya whispered. "He can't hurt you anymore." But Isabel couldn't shake the lingering fear that had taken root in her mind. Ethan had been so close, so relentless, and the thought of facing him again, even in a courtroom, filled her with dread. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and police interviews. Isabel was determined to see it through, no matter how difficult it was. Maya stayed by her side, her unwavering support giving her the strength to keep going. When the day of the trial finally arrived, Isabel felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. She took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted everything Ethan had done to her. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ethan sat across the room, his expression unreadable as he listened to her testimony. Isabel avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the judge and jury. She could feel the tension in the room, the gravity of the moment pressing down on her. As the trial continued, Isabel's confidence grew. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony of the witnesses painted a clear picture of Ethan's obsession. By the time the verdict was announced, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The judge declared Ethan guilty, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Isabel let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. It was over. Finally, truly over. As they left the courthouse, Isabel felt a strange sense of peace. The nightmare was behind her, and though the scars would remain, she knew she could start to heal. Maya squeezed her hand, her smile full of quiet pride. "You did it," she said. "You're free." Isabel nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. "Till death do us part." The sun was setting as the moving truck pulled away, leaving Emma and Mark standing in the driveway of their new home. The house loomed before them, its Victorian architecture both grand and foreboding, with its pointed gables and dark, weathered wood. Emma tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept up her spine as she gazed at the towering structure. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where they could build a life together, but the house seemed to watch them, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the dusk. Mark, oblivious to her unease, slung an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "This is it," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Our dream home." Emma forced a smile, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. Inside, the house was just as imposing as it was from the outside. High ceilings, ornate moldings, and a grand staircase gave it an air of faded elegance, but the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the floors creaked with every step. Emma wandered through the rooms, her fingers trailing over the peeling wallpaper and dusty surfaces. She tried to focus on the beautiful hardwood floors that could be refinished, the large windows that would let in light once the heavy drapes were removed, but the silence of the house felt oppressive, as though it were holding its breath. Mark, ever the optimist, was already unpacking boxes in the kitchen, his voice echoing as he hummed a tune. Emma joined him, determined to push aside her reservations. That night, they sat together on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and takeout containers. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Emma leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, trying to relax, but the stillness of the house unnerved her. It was too quiet, as though the walls were absorbing every sound. "It'll feel more like home once we've settled in," Mark said, sensing her unease. She nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to the dark corners of the room, half expecting something to move. "I know," she murmured. "It's just big and old. I guess it'll take some getting used to." When they finally went to bed, the silence followed them upstairs. Their bedroom was spacious but cold, the antique furniture casting eerie shapes in the moonlight that filtered through the windows. Emma lay awake long after Mark had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the house. Every creak and groan made her heart race, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, but when she sat up to listen, the sound stopped. She told herself it was just the house settling, an old structure groaning under its own weight, but the explanation didn't bring her any comfort. The next morning, Emma woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. For a moment, she felt a surge of optimism. Maybe the house wasn't as bad as she'd thought. Maybe it just needed a little love and attention to feel like a home. She got dressed and went downstairs, where Mark was sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug in his hands. "Morning," he said, smiling up at her. She returned the smile, but it faltered as she noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Not really. I kept hearing noises. Probably just the house settling, though." Emma nodded, but the unease in her chest grew thicker. The day was spent unpacking and arranging furniture, but the house seemed resistant to their efforts. The walls felt like they were closing in, and no matter how many lamps they turned on, the rooms always seemed dim. By late afternoon, Emma was exhausted, both physically and mentally. She retreated to the living room, sitting on the couch with a book, while Mark continued to work in the kitchen. As she tried to read, she became aware of a faint sound, like murmuring voices, coming from somewhere in the house. She glanced toward the kitchen, thinking it was Mark, but the sound didn't match his movements. It was low and indistinct, almost like whispering, and it seemed to be coming from the empty room across the hall. Emma stood, her heart pounding, and walked toward the sound. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open, half expecting to find nothing there. The room was empty, just as they had left it, but the whispering continued, soft and insidious, filling the air like a poison. She took a step inside, her eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a chorus of voices that grew louder the more she listened. She could almost make out words: anger, jealousy, betrayal, and the air grew colder, as though the room were filled with unseen presences. Emma backed away, her breath coming in short gasps, and fled the room, slamming the door behind her. Mark found her in the living room, pale and shaking, clutching the back of the couch for support. "Emma? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "Didn't you hear it?" she whispered. "The voices? In that room?" Mark frowned, shaking his head. I didn't hear anything. Are you sure it wasn't just the wind or something? Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't the wind, Mark. It was something else. He pulled her into a hug, but she could feel his hesitation, his doubt. He didn't believe her, and that realization made her feel more alone than ever. They spent the rest of the evening trying to pretend everything was normal, but the house's presence loomed over them like a shadow. Emma jumped at every sound, her nerves frayed, and Mark's attempts to reassure her felt hollow. When they went to bed that night, the whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. Emma buried her face in her pillow, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She held on to Mark tightly, as if he could protect her from whatever was in the house, but deep down, she knew he couldn't. By morning, both of them were exhausted, the sleepless nights taking their toll. Mark tried to convince Emma that they were just stressed, that the move and the unfamiliar house were playing tricks on their minds, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He had heard something too, even if he wouldn't admit it. They spent the day unpacking in silence, the weight of the house pressing down on them. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing, and Emma knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was in the house, something dark and vengeful, and it was only a matter of time before it showed itself. By the end of the week, the house had become a prison. The whispers were constant now, a cacophony of voices that followed them from room to room, and the shadows seemed to move when they weren't looking. Emma and Mark barely spoke, tension between them thick and unrelenting. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mark, still clinging to his skepticism, tried to reassure her, but his words rang hollow. They were trapped, and something in the house knew it. As the days wore on, Emma couldn't help but wonder if they would ever escape or if the house would claim them, just as it had claimed others before. The whispers had become a constant presence, a low buzzing in the back of Emma's mind that she couldn't escape. She tried to ignore them, to focus on unpacking and making the house feel like home, but it was impossible. The voices seemed to grow louder whenever she was alone, their words more distinct, more urgent. She heard arguments, accusations, and threats, all tangled together in a chaotic symphony that made her head spin. Mark had started spending more time outside, tending to the overgrown garden as if it could distract him from the oppressive atmosphere inside. Emma wished she could do the same, but the thought of being alone in the yard, surrounded by the house's looming shadow, made her feel even more vulnerable. One afternoon, while Mark was out running errands, Emma decided to investigate the room where she had first heard the whispers. She stood in the doorway for a long time, staring into the empty space, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was cold, the air thick with a feeling of dread that made her skin crawl. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and immediately felt as though she were being watched. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could make out fragments of sentences. "You'll never leave me. I'll make you pay. It's your fault." Emma clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing, and forced herself to search the room for any clues about its history. In the far corner, she found a loose floorboard, partially hidden beneath a dusty rug. Her hands trembled as she pried it up, revealing a small, tattered journal buried beneath it. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside was shaky and erratic. Emma hesitated before opening it, a sense of foreboding settling over her. The first entry was dated over 50 years ago, written by someone named Evelyn. The words were filled with despair, describing a loveless marriage, constant fighting, and a house that seemed to feed on their misery. As Emma flipped through the pages, the entries grew darker, more frantic, until they ended abruptly with a single line: "He's coming for me. I can't escape." That night, Emma showed the journal to Mark, her hands shaking as she recounted what she had found. His face turned pale as he read the entries, his usual skepticism nowhere to be found. "We need to look into the history of this house," he said, his voice tight with unease. "If there's a pattern, if something happened here, we need to know." Emma nodded, but the thought of digging deeper filled her with dread. The house already felt like a living, breathing entity, its presence suffocating and malevolent. Learning more about its past might only make it worse. The next day, they visited the local library, where an elderly librarian directed them to a collection of old newspapers and property records. As they sifted through the documents, a disturbing pattern emerged. The house had been the site of multiple tragedies over the decades, each one involving a married couple. There were reports of murder-suicides, unexplained deaths, and disappearances, all linked to the house. The stories were eerily similar. Couples moving in, their relationships deteriorating, and something dark taking hold of them. Emma's hands trembled as she read the accounts, her fear growing with every word. "It's not just one couple," she whispered. "It's all of them. The house, it's been doing this for years." Mark tried to reassure her, pointing out that they were different, that they could fight whatever was in the house, but his voice lacked conviction. The weight of what they had discovered hung over them like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. When they returned home, the house seemed darker, more menacing, as if it knew they were on to its secrets. The whispers returned that night, louder and more aggressive than ever, and Emma and Mark lay in bed, holding each other tightly, neither of them able to sleep. The following days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Emma began to see things out of the corner of her eye, shadows moving, figures standing in doorways, and the whispers became constant, a relentless barrage of voices that made it impossible to think. Mark, too, was on edge, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation, and the distance between them grew with every passing hour. They tried to talk about what was happening, to make a plan, but the house's influence was insidious, twisting their words and driving them apart. Emma could feel their connection fraying, and she didn't know how to stop it. One night, as they sat in the living room, the whispers suddenly stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in their wake. Emma looked at Mark, her eyes wide with fear, and saw that he was staring at something behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was faint, like a shadow given form, but she could make out the shape of a man, his face twisted with rage. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she reached for Mark, but he was frozen, his eyes locked on the figure. The man took a step forward, and the room grew colder, the air thick with a suffocating darkness. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The encounter left them both shaken, the reality of what they were facing sinking in. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here, Mark. It's too dangerous." But he shook his head, his expression grim. "Running won't solve anything. We have to figure out how to stop it." Emma wanted to argue, to beg him to listen to her, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't going to back down, no matter how dangerous it was. She just prayed they would survive long enough to find a way out. The days that followed were a nightmare. The house seemed to grow more hostile with each passing hour, the whispers turning into screams, the shadows becoming more solid, more threatening. Emma and Mark tried to resist, to hold on to each other, but the house's influence was too strong. They fought constantly, their arguments escalating into shouting matches that left them both exhausted and bitter. Emma could feel the house feeding on their anger, their pain, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed them completely. One evening, as they sat in silence, the tension between them palpable, Mark suddenly stood and walked out of the room without a word. Emma called after him, but he didn't respond. She followed him upstairs, her heart pounding, and found him standing in the room where she had found the journal. His back was to her, his shoulders rigid, and when she touched his arm, he turned to face her, his eyes dark and unrecognizable. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled a cold, unnerving smile that sent a chill down her spine. "It's too late," he said, his voice low and hollow. Then, before she could react, he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Emma crouched beside him, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. It was steady, but his skin was cold, his breathing shallow. She dragged him to their bedroom, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Whatever was in the house had taken hold of him, and she didn't know how to fight it. As she sat by his side, watching him sleep, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. Emma buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her face. They were running out of time, and she didn't know if they could survive the house's wrath. Mark woke the next morning, his eyes heavy and unfocused, as though he were emerging from a deep, unnatural sleep. Emma sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching him with a mixture of relief and fear. He groaned, rubbing his temples, and blinked up at her. What happened?" he murmured, his voice groggy. Emma hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. She didn't want to scare him, but she couldn't keep it from him anymore. "You passed out," she said carefully. "Last night, in that room. You weren't yourself." Mark frowned, trying to piece together fragments of memory, but his mind was a haze. "I don't remember," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We need to get out of here, Mark. This house, it's not safe." Mark, however, was stubborn, his determination to confront the house's darkness outweighing his fear. "We can't just leave," he insisted, sitting up slowly. "We've put everything into this place. We have to fight it, Emma. We can't let it win." She wanted to argue, to plead with him to listen to her, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't going to back down, no matter how dangerous it was. With a heavy heart, she agreed to stay, but only if they worked together to uncover the house's secrets. Mark nodded, though he seemed distant, as if something inside him had shifted. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely himself. They spent the day researching, combing through old records and newspaper archives for any information about the house's history. What they found was chilling. The house had been the site of multiple tragedies, each involving a married couple who had moved in, only to have their lives unravel in the most horrific ways. There were reports of murders, suicides, and disappearances, all linked to the house. The pattern was unmistakable, and it left Emma feeling hollow with dread. "It's not just us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been doing this for decades. We're just the latest in a long line of victims." Mark didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he stared at the documents before him. She could see the anger simmering beneath his surface, but she didn't know if it was directed at the house or something else. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Emma tried to block them out, burying her head under the pillow, but they seeped into her mind, filling her with a sense of despair that she couldn't shake. Mark lay beside her, his back turned, but she could tell by the tension in his shoulders that he wasn't sleeping. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows deeper, and Emma felt a presence lingering just out of sight. She reached for Mark, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond, his breathing steady but shallow. Emma's fear grew, but she was too exhausted to fight it. She closed her eyes, praying for morning to come. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and tension. The house's influence seemed to grow with each passing hour, its presence more oppressive, more malevolent. Emma began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing in doorways, and the whispers became a constant, relentless hum in the background of her thoughts. Mark, too, was on edge, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation, and the distance between them grew wider with every argument. Emma could feel their connection fraying, and she didn't know how to stop it. The house was tearing them apart, and she was powerless to do anything about it. One afternoon, while Mark was out dealing with errands, Emma decided to explore the house on her own. She hoped to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening to them. She started in the basement, a cold, damp space that smelled of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with old shelves, cluttered with forgotten items, broken tools, jars of nails, and boxes of yellowed photographs. As she sifted through the debris, she found a small, rusted metal box hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. Her hands shook as she pried it open, revealing a collection of letters, aged and brittle, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the first letter was familiar. It matched the journal she had found earlier. The letters were filled with anguish, detailing the slow unraveling of a marriage, the constant fighting, and the growing sense of dread that had consumed the couple. The writer, Evelyn, spoke of a dark presence in the house, a force that seemed to feed on their pain and anger. She described how her husband had changed, becoming more distant, more volatile, until one night he had attacked her. The last letter was unfinished, ending abruptly mid-sentence, and Emma felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her chest. She didn't want to believe it, but the similarities to her own situation were impossible to ignore. When Mark returned, Emma showed him the letters, her hands trembling as she explained what she had found. He read them in silence, his face pale, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes dark and haunted. "We're not going to let this happen to us," he said, his voice low and determined. "We'll fight it, Emma. We'll find a way to stop it." But she could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that they were already too late. The house's influence was too strong, its grip on them too tight. That night, the whispers grew louder, more aggressive, and Emma felt a presence in the room with them, watching, waiting. She tried to stay close to Mark, to hold on to him, but he seemed distant, his mind elsewhere. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and Emma felt a wave of despair wash over her. She knew the house was winning, that it was only a matter of time before it consumed them completely. She lay awake long after Mark had fallen asleep, her mind racing with fear and dread, praying for a way out that she couldn't see. The next day, Mark suggested they speak to a local historian, someone who might know more about the house's past. Emma agreed, though she doubted it would make a difference. They drove into town, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The historian, an elderly man with a kind face and gentle demeanor, listened to their story with a somber expression. "The house has a dark history," he confirmed. "It's been the site of many tragedies over the years. People say it's cursed, that it feeds on misery and pain." Emma's heart sank, but she pressed on. "Is there any way to stop it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The historian hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, "but if you're asking me, the best thing you can do is leave. Some things are better left alone." On the drive home, Emma couldn't shake the historian's words. She knew they needed to leave, but Mark was still determined to stay and fight. The tension between them grew, their arguments more frequent and more heated, and Emma could feel their bond slipping away. The house was winning, and she didn't know how much longer they could hold on. That night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. Emma buried her face in her pillow, trying to block them out, but they were relentless, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around her. Mark lay beside her, his breathing steady, but she could tell he wasn't asleep. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond, and she felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her chest. She reached for him, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "Mark," she said again, more urgently this time. He turned to face her, and she saw the darkness in his eyes, the emptiness that wasn't him. She knew then that the house had taken him, and she was alone. Emma woke to silence, a rare and unsettling absence of the whispers that had haunted her for weeks. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. She turned to Mark, hoping to find some comfort in his presence, but he was gone. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets cold. Panic shot through her as she sat up, her heart pounding. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She climbed out of bed, her legs unsteady, and hurried downstairs, calling his name. The house was eerily quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. She found him in the living room, standing in front of the fireplace, staring into the cold, empty grate. His back was to her, his posture rigid, and Emma hesitated, a chill creeping up her spine. "Mark?" she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. She took a step closer, her stomach twisting with dread. "Mark, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. Slowly, he turned to face her, and her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his expression was cold, devoid of any emotion she recognized. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and hollow. Emma's heart raced, and she took a step back, her mind reeling. "Mark, it's me. It's Emma. Talk to me, please." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The air in the room grew colder, and Emma felt a presence behind her, a shadow looming just out of sight. She turned, her breath hitching, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at Mark, he was closer, his movements unnaturally smooth. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice echoing with a strange, otherworldly quality. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. "Mark, please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. "Fight it. Whatever's happening, fight it." For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a glimmer of the man she loved, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "It's too late," he said, his voice a whisper. Emma stumbled backward, her fear giving her the strength to move. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty house as she made her way to the front door. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled at the handle, desperation fueling her strength, but the door wouldn't open. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the wood with her fists. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, and she turned to see Mark approaching, his expression blank, his eyes empty. "You can't leave," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You belong here. With me." Emma's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thinner. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding, and found herself trapped in the corner of the room. Mark stopped a few feet away, his head tilted slightly, as though studying her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice soft. "We're all part of it now. You, me, everyone who came before us. The house doesn't let go." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real. You're not real." He smiled, a cold, unnerving smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Oh, I'm real," he said. "And so is it." The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening, and Emma felt a presence all around her, pressing in from every side. She closed her eyes, her breathing ragged, and tried to focus, to think of a way out. But the whispers started again, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled her head, drowning out her thoughts. She sank to the floor, her hands clutching her ears, and screamed, the sound lost in the overwhelming noise. When she opened her eyes, Mark was gone, and she was alone in the darkness. The house was silent once more, the whispers fading into nothingness, but she knew it wasn't over. The house had claimed Mark, and now it was coming for her. Emma crouched in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering despite the suffocating warmth of the house. The silence was oppressive, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, and she fought to keep her breathing steady. She couldn't stay here, not like this, not with Mark gone and the house closing in around her. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but every thought felt muddled, as though the house itself were clouding her judgment. She glanced at the door, still locked, and then at the windows, their panes dark and unyielding. There had to be a way to escape, but the house seemed determined to keep her trapped. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, relief flooding her chest when she saw that it still had a signal. She dialed the first number that came to mind, her fingers shaking as she pressed the screen. The line rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered. "Emma? Is everything okay?" It was her sister, Laura, her tone filled with concern. Emma choked back a sob, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Laura, I need help. I'm at the house, and something's wrong. I can't leave. Mark, he's gone. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end, and then Laura's voice came through, steady and reassuring. "I'm coming, Emma. Just stay where you are. I'll be there as soon as I can." The call ended, and Emma clutched her phone to her chest, the small comfort of Laura's promise doing little to ease her fear. She could still feel the house's presence, a dark, malevolent force lurking just out of sight, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it made its next move. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her, and began to search for anything that could help her defend herself. The room was sparse, its furniture old and worn, but in one corner she found a heavy candlestick, its base solid and weighty. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The hours passed slowly, the house quiet but for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of footsteps. Emma stayed close to the door, her back against the wall, the candlestick gripped tightly in her hand. She tried to keep her mind focused, to think of a plan, but the silence was unnerving, and her thoughts kept spiraling back to Mark. Where was he? What had the house done to him? The questions haunted her, her fear and grief intertwining until she could barely breathe. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the cool wood of the door, and prayed for Laura to arrive soon. When the sound of tires crunching on gravel finally reached her ears, Emma's heart leapt with relief. She hurried to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to see a car pulling into the driveway. Laura stepped out, her face etched with worry, and Emma felt a surge of hope. She ran to the door, pulling at the lock, but it still wouldn't budge. "Laura!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. "I'm in here. The door's locked." Laura looked up, her eyes wide with alarm, and hurried to the door, pulling at the handle. "Emma, are you okay?" she called, her voice muffled through the wood. "What's going on?" Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. It's the house. It's alive. It won't let me out." Laura's expression hardened, and she stepped back, looking around for something to break the door down. She found a large rock near the edge of the driveway and hefted it in her hands, her determination clear. "Stand back, Emma," she said, her voice firm. Emma moved away from the door, her heart pounding, and a moment later there was a loud crash as Laura smashed the rock against the lock. The door shuddered, the wood splintering, and after a few more strikes, it finally swung open. Laura dropped the rock and rushed inside, pulling Emma into a tight embrace. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe now." Emma clung to her sister, her body shaking with relief, but even as Laura's warmth surrounded her, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the air. The house was silent now, but it didn't feel defeated. It felt patient, as though it were waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, pulling away from Laura. "We can't stay. It's not safe." Laura nodded, her eyes scanning the room with a mix of fear and determination. "Let's go," she said, taking Emma's hand and leading her toward the door. But as they stepped outside, the air seemed to shift, a cold wind sweeping through the yard. Emma froze, her heart racing, and turned to look back at the house. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the window, watching them, but when she blinked, it was gone. They hurried to the car, the sense of urgency driving them forward. But as Laura started the engine, the house's front door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Emma gasped, her eyes wide with fear, and Laura stepped on the gas, the tires spitting gravel as they sped down the driveway. Emma kept her eyes on the house, her heart pounding, until it disappeared from view. She sank back into the seat, her body trembling, and tried to steady her breathing. Laura reached over, squeezing her hand. "We're safe now," she said, her voice firm. "It's over." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The house had claimed Mark, and now it was watching her, waiting. Emma sat in Laura's living room, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. Laura had made her tea, setting it on the coffee table in front of her, but Emma hadn't touched it. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket, her mind replaying the events at the house over and over again. Laura sat beside her, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Emma, you need to tell me everything," she said gently. "What's going on? What happened to Mark?" Emma took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. The house, it's alive. It took him. It's trying to take me, too." Laura's brow furrowed, her skepticism evident, but she didn't interrupt. She listened as Emma recounted everything: the whispers, the shadows, the journal, the letters, and the way Mark had changed. His eyes dark and empty, his voice hollow. By the time Emma finished, her voice was trembling, and tears streamed down her face. Laura reached out, taking her hand in hers. "Emma, this sounds insane," she said carefully. "Are you sure Mark didn't just, I don't know, have a breakdown? Maybe he needs help." Emma shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not him, Laura. It's the house. It's doing this. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm not making this up. I saw it. I felt it." Laura hesitated, her grip on Emma's hand tightening. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's say I believe you. What do we do? How do we stop it?" Emma looked at her, desperate for answers but finding none. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we have to do something. We can't just leave Mark there." Laura nodded slowly, though her expression was still uncertain. "All right, we'll figure it out. But first, you need to rest. You're exhausted." Emma wanted to argue, to insist they act immediately, but her body betrayed her, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. She let Laura lead her to the guest room, her steps heavy, her mind foggy with exhaustion. That night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion. The silence of Laura's house should have been comforting, but it only made her feel more on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still with her, its presence lingering just out of sight. She turned restlessly, her mind refusing to quiet, and when she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, Mark's empty eyes staring back at her. The next morning, Laura found Emma in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes hollow and haunted. "Did you sleep at all?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern. Emma shook her head, her hands trembling as she set the mug down. "I can't stop thinking about him," she whispered. "I have to go back, Laura. I have to try to save him." Laura frowned, her arms crossed over her chest. "Emma, that's a terrible idea. Whatever's going on in that house, it's dangerous. You can't go back alone." Emma looked up at her, her eyes pleading. "Then come with me, please. I can't do this by myself." Laura hesitated, her expression conflicted, but finally she nodded. "All right," she said, "but we don't go in without a plan. We find out everything we can about that house, and we don't step foot inside until we know how to fight it." Relief washed over Emma, and she nodded, grateful for her sister's support. Laura pulled out her laptop, and they began to search for information, combing through old records, news articles, and local legends. What they found was chilling. The house had been the site of countless tragedies, each one eerily similar to what Emma and Mark had experienced. Couples would move in, their lives seemingly perfect, only to have everything fall apart in the most horrific ways. As they read through the accounts, a pattern began to emerge. The house seemed to feed on the pain and anger of its inhabitants, growing stronger with each tragedy. The more Emma learned, the more she realized how deep the house's roots went, and how difficult it would be to stop it. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "We can't just let it keep doing this." Laura nodded, though her expression was grim. "We'll find a way," she promised. "But we have to be careful. We can't let it get to us." That afternoon, they drove to the local library, hoping to find more information in the archives. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to their request with growing concern. "That house," she said, her voice low, "it's been the source of trouble for as long as I can remember. People have tried to destroy it, to cleanse it, but nothing works. It always comes back." Emma's heart sank, but she pressed on. "There has to be something we can do. There has to be a way to stop it." The librarian hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a story, an old one. They say the house was built on cursed ground, and the only way to break the curse is to destroy its source. But no one knows what that is." They left the library with more questions than answers, the librarian's words echoing in Emma's mind. The idea of destroying the source of the curse seemed impossible, but she clung to it, desperate for a glimmer of hope. As they drove back to Laura's house, Emma's resolve hardened. She didn't know how they would do it, but she was determined to find a way to end the house's hold on Mark. She couldn't lose him, not like this. The house had taken too much already, and she refused to let it win. Emma and Laura spent the next few days researching endlessly, their days filled with dusty books, old newspaper clippings, and endless conversations with locals who were willing to share what they knew. The more they dug, the more they uncovered, but none of it brought them closer to a solution. If anything, the stories only confirmed their worst fears. The house was a force beyond their understanding, its roots deep and its power unmatched. Emma grew increasingly restless, her determination to save Mark clashing with the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that threatened to consume her. Laura did her best to keep Emma focused, but even she was beginning to feel the weight of the task ahead. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of papers, Emma's frustration boiled over. "This is pointless," she snapped, slamming a book shut. "We're not getting anywhere. We're just wasting time, and Mark's still out there, trapped in that house." Laura looked up, her expression calm but firm. "We're doing everything we can, Emma. Rushing in without a plan isn't going to help him. We need to stay focused." Emma clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Staying focused isn't going to save him, Laura. We need to do something. Now." Laura sighed, setting down the papers she was holding. "What do you suggest? Because we still don't even know what we're up against. If we go in there without a plan, we're just going to end up like Mark or worse." Emma's shoulders slumped, her anger giving way to despair. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't lose him, Laura." Laura reached across the table, taking Emma's hand in hers. "We're not going to lose him," she said firmly. "But we have to be smart about this. We'll figure it out. Together." Later that night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every moment they spent researching was another moment Mark was slipping further away. She turned restlessly, her thoughts consumed by the house, the whispers, and Mark's empty eyes. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She got out of bed, pulling on a sweater and slipping quietly out of Laura's house. The cool night air hit her face as she walked to her car, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she couldn't sit still any longer. She had to try. The drive to the house was a blur, her hands gripping the steering wheel as her mind raced. When she pulled into the driveway, her stomach twisted with dread, but she forced herself to get out of the car. The house loomed before her, its windows dark, its silence unnerving. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked to the front door. It creaked open as she pushed it, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. Inside, the air was heavy, the shadows deeper than she remembered. She stepped inside, her heart pounding, and called out Mark's name. Her voice echoed through the empty rooms, but there was no response. She moved cautiously through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispers began almost immediately, soft and insidious, filling her mind with doubts and fears. She shook her head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. "Mark?" she called again, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" There was no answer, but she thought she heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. She hesitated, her fear mounting, but she forced herself to climb the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched before her, dark and foreboding. The whispers grew louder, more intense, and she felt a presence behind her, icy breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "You're not real. You're not real." She turned back to the hallway, her eyes scanning the darkness, and that's when she saw it, a faint light spilling from the doorway at the end of the hall. She hesitated, her fear warring with her determination, but she forced herself to move toward it. The room was bathed in a dim, flickering light, the source coming from a single candle on the floor. In the center of the room, Mark sat hunched over, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond, didn't move, and she stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Mark, it's me," she said, her voice shaking. "Please talk to me." She reached out to touch his shoulder, but before she could, he turned to face her. His eyes were empty, his face pale, and his lips curled into a cold, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice hollow and distant. Emma's heart raced, her fear overwhelming, but she forced herself to stay. "Mark, fight it," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You're stronger than this. Please, come back to me." He tilted his head, studying her with an expression she didn't recognize. "There's no fighting it," he said softly. "It's too late." Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding as Mark's cold, empty gaze bore into her. The air in the room grew thicker, the candle's flame flickering wildly as though caught in an invisible wind. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a chaotic symphony that made her head ache. She clutched her temples, trying to block them out, but they only seemed to intensify, drowning out her thoughts. Mark stood slowly, his movements unnaturally fluid, and took a step toward her. Emma backed away, her chest tightening with fear. "Mark, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "This isn't you. You're still in there somewhere. I know it." He didn't respond, his expression unchanged, and took another step forward. Emma's back hit the wall, and she froze, trapped between him and the unyielding surface behind her. She scanned the room desperately, searching for an escape, but there was none. Mark stopped just in front of her, his face inches from hers, and she could feel the cold emanating from him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and hollow. "There's no going back. Not for me. Not for you." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I won't let it take you. I won't." She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek, hoping to find some shred of the man she loved. But his skin was icy, lifeless, and he didn't react. The whispers grew deafening, their voices sharp and accusatory, and Emma felt a pressure building in her chest, as though the air itself were crushing her. She stumbled away from Mark, gasping for breath, and collapsed to the floor. The room spun around her, the walls seeming to close in, and she clutched her head, trying to drown out the noise. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, just stop." For a moment, the whispers paused, the silence sudden and unnatural. Emma looked up, her vision swimming, and saw Mark standing over her, his expression unreadable. "It's too late," he repeated, his voice softer now, almost sorrowful. "You shouldn't have come back." Emma shook her head, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "I had to," she whispered. "I couldn't leave you. I still can't." Mark knelt in front of her, his movements slow and deliberate, and reached out to touch her face. His fingers were cold, but there was a faint warmth behind his eyes, a glimmer of the man she knew. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have to go. It's not safe here." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I'm not leaving you. Not again." He closed his eyes, his hand falling away from her face, and when he opened them again, the warmth was gone. His expression hardened, his gaze cold and distant. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice firm. He stood abruptly, pulling her to her feet with surprising strength, and turned her toward the door. "Go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emma hesitated, her heart breaking, but she knew he was right. Staying would only make things worse. She took a step toward the door, her legs unsteady, and glanced back at him one last time. "I'll come back for you," she promised, her voice trembling. "I'll find a way to save you." Mark didn't respond, his face impassive, and Emma forced herself to turn away, her steps slow and heavy as she made her way out of the room. The whispers started again, soft and insidious, but she ignored them, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The house seemed to shift around her, the hallways stretching longer, the shadows deeper, but she pressed on, refusing to let it stop her. When she finally reached the front door, she paused, her hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. She glanced back one last time, the house looming behind her, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit her face, and she took a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. She stumbled to her car, her mind racing, and climbed in, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The drive back to Laura's was a blur, her thoughts consumed by Mark and the house. She didn't know how she was going to save him, but she knew she couldn't give up. The house had taken too much already, but she refused to let it win. Emma arrived back at Laura's house in the early hours of the morning, her body trembling and her mind racing. She barely remembered the drive back, her thoughts consumed by the image of Mark's hollow eyes and the cold, lifeless way he had spoken to her. Laura was waiting in the living room, her face etched with worry, and she rushed to Emma as soon as she walked through the door. "Where were you?" Laura demanded, her voice sharp with fear. "I woke up and you were gone. I thought something had happened to you." Emma sank into a chair, her legs giving out beneath her. "I went back to the house," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to see him." Laura's expression darkened, her worry turning to anger. "Are you insane? Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? You could have gotten yourself killed." Emma looked up at her, tears filling her eyes. "I had to try, Laura. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing." Laura sighed, running a hand through her hair, and sat down across from Emma. "Well, what happened? Did you see him?" Emma nodded, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "He's still in there, but it's like he's gone. Like the house has taken everything that made him Mark. He told me to leave, that it wasn't safe. But I can't just leave him there. I have to find a way to save him." Laura leaned forward, her expression serious. "Emma, I know you want to help him, but we still don't even know what we're dealing with. We can't just rush in blind. We need a plan." Emma nodded, though her frustration was evident. "I know, but we're running out of time. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to get him back." Laura reached out, taking Emma's hand in hers. "I get it. I do. But we have to be smart about this. Let's go over everything we've learned and see if we can piece something together. There has to be a way." They spent the next several hours going through all the research they had gathered, searching for any clue that could help them. The house's history was filled with tragedy, and the more they read, the more it became clear that it fed on the pain and despair of its inhabitants. "It's like a parasite," Laura said, her voice filled with disgust. "It takes everything good and twists it into something dark." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the pages. "But there has to be a way to stop it." The librarian said something about destroying the source of the curse. "Maybe we can find what that is." Laura frowned, her brow furrowing. "But how? We've been through all of this, and we still don't know what the source is." Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What if it's the house itself? What if we can burn it down or something? Laura shook her head. "People have tried that before. It always comes back. It's like it can't be destroyed." Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Then what do we do? There has to be something we're missing." Laura hesitated, then leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What about the journal? The one you found in the attic? Is there anything in it that could help?" Emma's eyes widened as she remembered the journal. "I forgot about that," she said, jumping up from her chair. "It's still in my car. I didn't even think to bring it in." She hurried outside, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope, and returned with the journal clutched in her hands. She set it on the table, flipping through the pages until she found the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible, but the message was clear. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The source. It's in the basement." That's where it all started. Emma and Laura stood in the kitchen, the journal open on the table between them, its pages filled with the desperate scribbles of someone who had clearly been consumed by fear. The entry they had found spoke of a hidden room in the basement, a place where the house's power originated. Emma's hands trembled as she traced the words with her finger, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is how we stop it." Laura leaned over, her eyes scanning the page, her expression grim. "If this is true, then we need to be careful. We don't know what we're walking into." Emma nodded, though her determination was stronger than her fear. "I know, but we don't have a choice. We have to try." Laura hesitated, then placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "All right, but we're doing this together. No heroics, okay? We go in, find the source, and get out. No detours." Emma looked at her, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." Laura gave her a small smile. "You'd probably get yourself killed. Now, let's get ready. We'll need supplies, flashlights, matches, anything that might help." They spent the next hour gathering what they could, their preparations filled with a tense silence as they both grappled with the enormity of what they were about to do. When they were ready, they stood at the front door, their bags slung over their shoulders, their faces set with determination. "Are you sure about this?" Laura asked, her voice soft but firm. Emma took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, but I have to try. For Mark." Laura nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's go." The drive to the house was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Emma's thoughts were consumed by Mark, his empty eyes and cold, lifeless voice haunting her every time she closed her eyes. Laura kept her focus on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When they pulled into the driveway, Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The house loomed before them, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their every move. "Ready?" Laura asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ready." They stepped out of the car, the air around them heavy with an unnatural stillness. The whispers started as soon as they approached the front door, soft and insidious, trying to worm their way into their minds. Emma clenched her teeth, forcing herself to ignore them, and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and made their way toward the basement door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but they pressed on, their resolve unshakable. The basement stairs were rickety, the wood groaning under their weight as they descended. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness seeming to swallow their flashlights' beams. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a large empty room, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars and strange, unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, its edges crumbling with age. "This is it," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go down there." Laura nodded, though her face was pale. "Let's do it. But be careful." They opened the trapdoor, the hinges squealing in protest, and peered down into the darkness below. A narrow staircase led further down, the air damp and musty. Emma took the first step, her heart racing, and Laura followed close behind. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as they descended, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of fear and anger. Emma clutched her flashlight tightly, her knuckles white, and forced herself to keep moving. When they reached the bottom, They found themselves in a small, circular room, its walls covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface stained with something dark and ominous. On top of the altar was a small, ornate box, its surface intricately carved with the same symbols that covered the walls. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she approached it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed against the box, the whispers stopped, the silence sudden and deafening. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "This is the source." Laura stepped forward, her flashlight trained on the box, her expression filled with disbelief and fear. "What do we do with it?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. "We destroy it," she said finally, her voice firm. "But how?" Laura asked, her eyes wide. Emma looked around the room, her gaze falling on the symbols etched into the walls. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we have to try."